Thank you for joining what California college students need policymakers to know about how COVID-19 has affected them. My name is Shannon Serrato, Communications Director at the Institute for College Access and Success. Before handing it over to our moderator for the day, I wanted to highlight a few items. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants and online following today's event. Closed captioning is available for the webinar. To enable, simply click the CC button to launch the tool. There is a question and answer at the end of this event, so if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If technical assistance is needed during the webinar, please contact TICAS Senior Comms Associate Angelique Palomar. Her contact info will be in the chat. And with that, I'll turn it over to our event moderator, Lindsay Allman. Lindsay, take it away.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Shannon, and welcome everyone. I'm Lindsay. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm so happy to be moderating today's webinar in my capacity as TICAS's Associate Director of Research and Knowledge Management. TICAS is a nonpartisan research and policy advocacy organization working to make higher education more affordable and more equitable nationally and in California and in Michigan as well. For over 15 years, we've drawn attention to and worked to remove barriers to and through college. Through this work, we've long known that financial constraints in college costs, in particular, those non-tuition college costs, make it more difficult and in too many cases impossible for some students to achieve their educational goals. And much of our work focuses on strengthening financial aid to ensure students have the supports they need and the resources they need to complete a quality degree. When the pandemic hit, all our lives were impacted, suddenly and profoundly, and the same is true of college students. Facing an unprecedented moment in higher education, colleges and universities closed campuses nationwide, moving online at a scale never before seen. Students with children face the same impossible puzzle as parents all over the country who found themselves suddenly without childcare or school at the same time as their own work and school. And working college students were no less affected by the pandemic's economic impact that rippled throughout the country and left millions without jobs. The pandemic shed light on and made more acute a number of social and economic inequalities that predated the crisis, and college affordability barriers are no different. They're just no exception. You'll hear today about how COVID-19 has impacted the vast majority of students, but in different ways. If COVID-19 is a storm we've all been navigating through, I think our data show that students have been navigating that storm in different ships, with many students impacted in ways that make our prior reform efforts all the more urgent. Students are at the center of our work at TICAS, and today you'll hear from two students who will share their stories about how the pandemic has impacted their lives and education. These students' experiences underscore the findings that we'll share from a student survey we conducted this past January. As we begin turning the corner on the pandemic, students' experiences throughout the COVID-19 crisis make even more urgent the longstanding need to strengthen student supports to not only correct the structural shortcomings of the higher education system we carried with us into the pandemic, but to help higher education emerge from this period stronger and more equitable than ever. We'll end by hearing from two TICAS policy experts who will discuss specific recommendations for both state and federal policymakers, after which we'll make space for questions from the audience. A deep felt thanks for all of you for joining us today. Our hope is that the lessons from the stories, research, and policy perspectives you'll hear today will help guide the holistic student-centered reform that we need to ensure higher education can fulfill its promise as an inclusive and just engine of economic mobility. So without further ado, I'd like to kick us off by inviting Christina Torres onto our virtual stage to introduce herself and have a conversation with me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina and I am 25 years old. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I like to go by Chris as well, so you guys can call me Chris. Sorry about that. I also have 3 kids. My oldest is 9 years old, my middle child is 5, and my youngest is 4. And I'm also a college student and a youth advocate.
Thank you so much for joining us, Christina. It's good to see your face. So can you tell us a little bit about what your path into college was like?
Yes. So I was in foster care until I was 18, and then you exited out at the AB-12 program. Right when I turned 18, I enrolled into the summer and the fall classes of Bakersfield College here in Bakersfield. And I was going to school, going to my classes, but then an unfortunate event happened and I became homeless. And during that time I was homeless. I was homeless for a while actually. And going to school, taking care of my daughter, working, it was very difficult to try to focus on schooling more than focusing on where am I going to eat? What is my daughter going to eat? Where is she going to sleep? Where am I going to sleep? And so I kind of dropped out of school right then and there. So it was very difficult to try to continue going to school while being homeless and also attempting to work as well.
I can imagine. That sounds like a lot to have to deal with. Were you out for a while and were able to return?
Yes, so I was out for 2 years until I was able to go back, but then I found myself in the same situation of being homeless. It was very difficult to try and same thing all over again, so I had to stop going to college again.
Wow, that's certainly a lot. And when were you finally able to enroll again?
Last year in the spring of 2020, I was able to enroll.
And that's just right when the pandemic hit.
Yeah. So I was going to school and I was also working at the time too. I was working with the county here, and it was going really well. But then once the pandemic hit, it was very difficult to try and take care of my daughter while she's in school. While I'm in school, I'm working remotely and online school. So I took a break off of school just so I can focus more on my daughter while she was in distant learning. But when work, now that's a different story because I was working from home. But when everything started to open up, like the first time, that's when I lost my job because of budget cuts and all of that budget cuts that because I was the extra help person, and so they had to cut me.
That sounds like an immense challenge to try to overcome. Were you able to re-enroll at any point after that?
Yes, so I did enroll this semester, and I re-enrolled for the fall and the winter and the spring semester of this upcoming school year. I kind of failed last semester of last year, so I had to make up the classes for this year, but luckily I passed it, so that's a plus.
Yeah, oh, I can imagine it would be difficult to focus on studies and really excel when you were still dealing with taking care of your children and their online education and trying to find work too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's like for you right now? Have you been able to get back into school? You're enrolled now?
Yes, so I am in school. I'm currently on my break. I'm going back to school in fall. I'm currently looking for a job. I want to work within the foster care system because it's just my passion. I want to be able to make change. It's been going really well.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. So let me ask you, thinking back over this journey through college for you so far, what would have helped you and stayed enrolled over that whole time? And what kind of supports do you need right now to continue to stay enrolled and graduate?
So what would have helped me back then would have been maybe more housing resources and also childcare. That is a big thing because I'm a single parent, so it's really hard to go and try to find a sitter for when you're working and going to school and stuff. I think childcare. What would help me stay in school now? Maybe a grant that would that's not just for tuition costs, but it'll cover like housing, food, if I need transportation, like a bus pass, or even purchasing a car for school, or because a lot of times, a lot of the grants are for tuition and it's not for like your housing. If I were able to get a grant like that, I probably would have stayed in school and I would have already had my master's or something already. So I just think to help us youth is to be able to go above and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
My eyes, because we're already going through so much with the stability and like the barriers and the college life. It would be so helpful if that grant could just cover not just tuition though. Like a new computer, because I need a new computer. Even if it'll help cover childcare, because childcare is very hard to get right now, especially with the pandemic, and not a lot of people are accepting childcare. So maybe if we can get a grant, that'll cover that too.
Yeah, those are all really great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Christina. And can you stick around in case anybody has a question for you at the end?
Yes, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So thank you, Christina, again. We're going to hear from another student in a bit. And before I turn the stage over to my colleague, Nancy Wong, to share some of our research findings, first, I'd like to introduce everybody to our survey effort. Given known structural shortcomings of the financial aid system that predate the pandemic, TICAS was immediately and deeply concerned for how the pandemic would affect students' abilities to continue their education. While we knew college students' finances were undoubtedly strained in new ways, and we're hearing stories that the pandemic was exacerbating students' existing financial vulnerabilities, little was known at the time about how exactly students' finances were changing and how those changes were impacting their academic plans. So in order to better understand the unique financial impacts of the pandemic on college students and help guide the development of a robust targeted interventions needed to support students through this time and beyond, we developed a survey focused on students' changed finances and academic plans. First off, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Michelson 20MM Foundation for making this survey and this webinar possible. So thank you very much. TICAS designed the survey, and it was administered early this year by Hart Research Associates between January and February. And the results you'll hear today reflect 875 responses from students who were enrolled in a California institution in spring 2020 and who had not yet completed their program by the end of that term or the summer 2020 term. All of the analysis of the survey data was done by TICAS. To ensure representativeness, our results are weighted by institution type as well as gender within institution type. And throughout the webinar, any mention of institution type will refer to the type of school a student was enrolled in spring 2020. Our responses by institution type are shown here on this slide. And lastly, all the data are self-reported. So now I'll turn it over to Nancy Wong, Senior Research Associate at TICAS, to share some takeaways about students' budgets and academic plans. And as she presents some of our findings, feel free to add any questions you have in the chat, and we'll turn to them at the end of their webinar.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Lindsay. I'm excited to be sharing data from our survey with you all today. So first up, I'll be discussing overall changes to student finances and academic plans, specifically looking at changes to student budgets, the impact of non-tuition expenses, the disproportionate impact of the financial strain, and changes to students' expected time to degree. So students were asked a series of questions on the survey related to their budget. One of the questions that we asked students was whether their income had increased, been reduced, or not changed at all as a result of the pandemic. We found that about 1 in 3 or 31% of students reported no change to income, while another 1 in 6 or 16% of students had their income increase during this time. However, over half of students had their income decrease during the pandemic. These changes to student income can affect students' ability to pay and cover overall student expenses, which we will discuss in the next slide. So we also asked students if since the start of the pandemic in March 2020, whether they had been spending more, less, or about the same on a monthly basis. We found that nearly all student expenses have changed since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Only 14% of students report no changes at all in their expenses. So of the students experiencing changes, we found that 24% report expenses only going down, 19% report expenses only going up, and 43% of students report some type of expenses going up and down. Our overall takeaway is that while COVID-19 has changed the vast majority of student expenses and at a cost for many students, it didn't change for the worse for everyone, but rather it seems to have generated a lot of volatility in student expenses. One particular group of concern are those students with increased expenses and reduced income. So of the 19% of students who report expenses only going up, 6 in 10 students also report incomes declining. Students also indicated which type of expenses changed in the pandemic. We found that among the different types of expenses, monthly food costs were the most commonly reported as increasing and transportation costs most commonly reported as decreasing, which you can see on the two tables here on the slide. One thing that we want to note is that these figures refer only to whether an expense type went up or down. We had also asked students about the degree to which those expense changes have made it harder for students to continue their education. So although food was the most common expense increase and did make it difficult for many students to continue, it is not the type of expense change most commonly reported as making it harder for student enrollment. So books and supplies were actually the most commonly reported as being a burden on student enrollment, which we'll discuss in the next slide. We found that 1 in 4 students reported spending more on books and supplies since the start of the pandemic, and over half of the students with that increase reported that this increase made it harder to stay enrolled. This is especially true for students who identified as financial aid recipients in spring 2020, who are more likely than non-financial aid recipients to report this. We also looked at the burden of books and supplies by segment, and we found that among the different segments, so community colleges, the CSU system, the UC system, and private colleges, that community college students were the most likely to report that increases in books and supplies created a burden on their enrollment. Beyond looking at only just books and supplies, the most commonly reported as burdensome expense also varied by segment. So specifically for these community college students, that increases in child, elder, and dependent care were the most burdensome for them. We also examined financial strain by race and ethnicity. We asked students if, as a result of the pandemic's impact on student income or expenses, if they experience increased indicators of food insecurity. For example, skipping meals, reducing how much they ate at meals, being afraid that food would run out before they're able to purchase more, or any difficulty paying for housing. Our survey indicated that over half of Black and Latinx students report increased indicators of food insecurity, and half of Black students also report missing a rent, mortgage, or utility payment. These types of financial hardships can make it difficult for students to complete their degree. Speaking of degree completion, we also asked students if, as a result of the pandemic, they now expect to complete their degree sooner or later than planned. The majority of students, so 6 in 10 students, expect to receive their degree later, while 1 in 8 or 13% expected degree acceleration, and more than 1 in 4 or 28% expected no changes to their degree timing. Taking a deeper dive into disparities among expected degree delays expected delays in degree timing, we see clear differences in the pandemic's impact on academic plans, with some groups of students much more likely to now expect it to take longer to complete their degree. So for example, 2/3 of California community college students expect to receive their degree later than planned, compared to 52% of CSU students and 48% of UC students. There were also clear differences by race and ethnicity. We found that more than 3 in 5 Filipino, Black, Indigenous, Native American, and Latinx students report now expecting degree delays. And these degree delays are especially concerning considering the pre-existing racial equity gaps in college access and attainment for these groups. And finally, disparities by age also existed. So we found that 6 in 10 students aged 25 or older report expecting degree delays, compared to a little over half of students younger than 25. In the next part of the survey, we asked students to describe in their own words how the pandemic had affected their college plans. So several themes emerged from student responses, including new financial strain, family obligation, challenges of online learning, and limited course availability. For new financial strain, students who reported expecting a delay were more likely to report experiencing job loss, a reduction in job hours, and taking a lower paying job. So looking specifically at job loss, about 40% of delayed students report losing their job, compared to only 30% of students not expecting a delay. Of the 40% who reported losing their job, these students also report at least one parent also lost a job during the pandemic. And so these students are really having a double whammy effect on their income. We also looked at reduction in job hours. So over half of students experience a reduction in job hours, and compared to only 44% of non-delayed students. And then specifically looking at lower paying job, over a third of delayed students report having to take a lower paying job compared to only a quarter of non-delayed students. We also found that older students, so those aged 25 or older, were more likely to report taking a lower paying job than younger students as well. One student explained about the new financial strain that they face. I registered for college in fall of 2020, but decided not to attend due to COVID-19. My priorities changed. I need to have a stable source of income. Students also explained that family obligations impeded their ability to attend class or complete homework or other assignments. So 27% of delayed students report being unable to attend class or complete homework due to care for dependents, elderly, or sick family members compared to only 20% of non-delayed students. When it comes to homeschooling, 20% of delayed students report being unable to attend class because they needed to homeschool family members compared to 14% of non-delayed students. One student explained, since my stepson had to stay home, I had to teach him along with online school. That, along with my health concerns, it's not possible for me to continue. And finally, we also asked students why they chose not to re-enroll in the following fall and spring semesters. Over a third of students pointed to concerns about online courses as a reason they didn't enroll in fall 2020. Students stated classes are not the same as in person. I've been suffering academic-wise. I feel I'm not learning. Similar shares of students who did not re-enroll in spring 2021 also pointed to these exact same concerns. Students also indicated that another reason that they did not re-enroll was about the class options available. 1 in 5 students pointed to a lack of class availability as a reason that they didn't re-enroll in fall 2020, and even higher shares, so close to 1/3 of students who didn't re-enroll in spring 2021 pointed to this reason as well. Some delayed students report that courses and training that they needed to complete their programs are by virtue of their subject not able to be delivered online, or that courses delivered online filled up too quickly. One student explained, totally destroyed my college plans. I'm a science major and I can't even take lab courses on campus. So now that we've had an opportunity to hear about the student changes to academic plans and finances, as well as their own experiences of the pandemic in their own words, we will be segueing into our next student story.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And per that great transition, we're going to invite Erica Jason to join me on stage, on the virtual stage here for our conversation about what navigating college has been like for them. Hey, Erica.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi. Would you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Erica Jason. I'm 26. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I grew up in Southern California and I currently live in Sonoma County. And I am a student at San Francisco State University. My major is child and adolescent development with a minor in special education.
Nice. So tell us what your path into college was like.
When I graduated high school in 2013, I applied to San Francisco State and I went there until 2015, but I dropped out of school. I was falling behind in my classes and I was struggling with my mental health. So I went back home to my parents' house in Southern California, and I was able to get access to mental health services in addition to I started taking medication for my anxiety and depression at an affordable price. So that was helpful. And then during that time, I found my way into a career as a behavior therapist working with children with autism. And after about a year of doing that, my partner and I moved to Berkeley, where I got a job as a behavior technician in a school setting. During that time, I had still been attending community college classes, kind of making up for some of the classes I had failed earlier to get myself in a stepping stone where I could reapply. And about 2 years of living in Berkeley, I reapplied. And in 2019, I went back to San Francisco State.
Nice. Anything you did that second time that was different?
Yes, the second time I went was different, very different.
Aside from the pandemic, we'll get there.
Right. So this time I kind of had learned from a lot of my mistakes. So I knew how to kind of stay on top of my classes, which was a struggle for me in the beginning. But also during that time, a student in one of my classes had mentioned the Disability Resources Program. And I was curious about it because, if you do have anxiety or depression, that is considered a disability. And so I got my paperwork from my doctor's office and applied to the program. So that way, if I ever was, had like a panic attack or something like that, and I were to fall behind in class, I was able to make up for it. So I applied to that, and that was a saving grace for me, because at one point during the pandemic, we experienced a death, and that set me back, a couple weeks. And so I was able to use, really just kind of, I like stayed on top of my class, but then I also had this to catch me if I fell behind, and I was able to make up for my work. And so that was very helpful.
I can imagine a support system like that is so critical. I'm glad you were able to connect with it. What about college costs? We know that they're a barrier for a lot of students. Did you have any concerns about affording college a second time? How did you navigate all that?
So I was really fortunate, and the first 2 years I had gone to San Francisco State, my parents financed that for me. The second time around, I waited until I was 24, so I was eligible for state and federal aid. So I applied for financial aid, which covered my tuition. So as far as college was concerned, the grant aid paid for it. And then I also worked a part-time job 3 days a week, went to school 2 days a week, and then that covered my rent and food expenses.
So you had aid covering tuition, but you needed to work to make up the rest there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what happened when how did your life change? Did it change when the pandemic hit? Did your job change? Housing change? School change?
Yes. So everything changed when the pandemic hit. At first, so my partner and I moved to Southern California. At first, it was just going to be temporary because we thought it was only going to last 2 weeks and we would go back. But as it became apparent that it was going to be long term, we decided to move in with them. So we put in our month notice for the room we were renting in Berkeley and lived with my parents, which was, it was nice to all be together, but at the same time, it helped us out financially because then I could just focus on school and not worrying about having to work and pay for rent. Although in the beginning, I wasn't working because it was the pandemic. No one was working, but we were lucky that the public schools had been given aid. So that covered my typical wages up until that summer.
And then that went away, and then your income suddenly took a hit.
Exactly. So then staying with my parents became the right choice. So we are actually there for 8 months until November.
Wow. All right. So you navigated a lot, and then at the same time, it sounds like you had a lot of resources, even though it sounds like it was actually still probably hard to navigate all of that, even with that.
Right. But the resources and the help, and I wouldn't have been able to get through it if it wasn't for the support system that I had.
Yeah. And so what's life like now for college? Are you, you're still enrolled, or what are your plans?
Yeah. So I was able to stay in school with, I was able to stay in school because I wasn't able to work as much. My hours were significantly cut. And because I wasn't paying for rent, I was able to focus on school instead of having to put that on the back burner and work. So I stayed in school. I'm graduating this summer, 2020.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So what's one thing that you would say based on your experience to policymakers considering how to strengthen the higher education system so that all students can achieve their goals and stay on track the way you did?
Yeah, so what I would say to policymakers is that all students need financial stability if they are able to get through college. So in my case, I had access to, financial aid and, I had access to like food and groceries. So students need those things covered, and they need financial stability, which includes access to housing. So
Yeah.
every student needs, a roof over their head. They need somewhere to sleep. And also the other thing that helped me was access to affordable healthcare. I wouldn't have been able to get my disability service resources if I hadn't had like a doctor's note, and that, and not a lot of people are able to get official diagnoses because they would need access to the healthcare. So all students need access to healthcare and affordable healthcare, and including medication, because I know a lot of students who have to go off their medication because they can't afford it, and that can result in like psychosis and other really harmful things can happen. So healthcare, housing, and financial stability are the three things that I want policymakers to consider when making higher education available for everybody.
Those are excellent suggestions. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Erica. And can you stick around in case folks have questions for you?
Yes, thanks, Lindsay.
Excellent. And congratulations again on your upcoming graduation, getting through all that.
Thank you.
So turning now to our research findings, turning back to our research findings, I'd like to invite us to consider the impact of the pandemic on student loan borrowers in particular. We know that college costs and limited financial resources make student debt a reality for millions of students who would otherwise not be able to cover the full cost of attendance, which includes both tuition and things like food, housing, and books. We also know that far too many borrowers struggle to repay that debt. And these loan repayment concerns have been around long before the pandemic, including for the more than 1 million borrowers who newly defaulted on their federal student loans in the 12 months preceding the public health crisis. The financial disruptions caused by the pandemic, which Nancy spoke to earlier, have made it more difficult for many students to cover basic needs and continue their education. And given longstanding concerns about repayment hardships, we were particularly interested in learning how the pandemic has impacted students with loans. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Anna Fung, Program Associate at TICAS, to share what our survey reveals about student loan borrowers who were enrolled in school when the pandemic hit.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay, for the introductions. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. Before diving into what our survey shows about how student loan borrowers have been impacted by the pandemic, a few points are helpful to keep in mind. At the start of the pandemic, policymakers were rightly focused on the need to provide relief, specifically for student loan borrowers in order to prevent a wave of new defaults. As a result, as of March 2020, monthly student loan payments and interest accrual for almost all federal student loans have been suspended, and collections on defaulted federal loans have also been halted. These efforts have been critical for the tens of millions of borrowers who benefited from this emergency forbearance status, which currently extends through September 30th, 2021. But importantly, because the borrowers we surveyed were still enrolled in school when the pandemic began, some of them may not have entered repayment on their student loans, and therefore would not have experienced these benefits as any real change to their current financial circumstances. At the same time, the federal government also provided funds directly to institutions, for colleges themselves to give emergency financial aid directly to students, and over half of the borrowers in our survey report receiving emergency aid from their schools, which notably is nearly twice the rate of their non-borrower peers. And crucially, almost all the borrowers who received this emergency aid also said it was important for supporting their continued enrollment. One of our main findings is that 3 in 5 borrowers expressed being more worried about their ability to repay their loans than before the pandemic. Clearly, despite the different forms of relief that borrowers are receiving, too many of them still unfortunately grapple with increased worry about student loan repayment. To better understand the story behind the rates of increased repayment concern, we looked at different aspects of financial hardship that students reported over the course of the pandemic. We found through our survey that since the pandemic began, student loan borrowers have faced financial hardships at a disproportionate rate compared to their peers. Some of their struggles include being almost 4 times more likely than their non-borrowing peers to have lost their housing, 3 times more likely to have trouble paying for the cost of caring for dependents, and twice as likely to have missed a mortgage, rent, or utility payment. At the same time, and despite being more likely to have received emergency aid from their colleges, our survey also reveals that respondents already carrying student debt are much more likely than their counterparts to have accrued new, riskier forms of debt over the course of the pandemic. Specifically, borrowers are much more likely to have taken out new private loans. And this is especially concerning because those are riskier forms of loans that usually have higher interest rates and lack critical borrower protections such as deferment and forbearance options, income-driven repayment plans, and a current emergency forbearance relief, all of which are applicable to federal student loans, thus making federal student loans the safest option for students who need to borrow to cover college costs. Accruing additional credit card debt has been even more ubiquitous, with nearly half of all borrowers reporting increased credit card debt compared to just less than a quarter of non-borrowers. Our survey makes clear that borrowers who were enrolled at the start of the pandemic have experienced disproportionate difficulties that threaten to increase the risk of their long-term serious financial hardships. And now I'll turn it back over to Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Anna. And a reminder, if you have any questions for Anna, Nancy, Erica, or Chris, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A chat box for our question and answer section that will follow our policy discussion. So hearing these survey results alongside the stories of our 2 students really underscores the opportunities that policymakers have to better support students' higher education journeys. And before turning to our 2 policy experts, I'd like to take a minute to reflect on what our survey shows about the kind of pandemic-related support some students have already received, as well as what students themselves reported in the survey about what would help them achieve their own higher education goals. We heard from Anna that students with loans were more likely to report having received emergency financial assistance from their schools than their non-borrowing peers. Overall, less than half, 42% of students told us they received COVID-related financial assistance from their colleges. And importantly, the vast majority of these students who received that assistance reported that it was important in allowing them to continue their enrollment. The aid was particularly important for older students, part-time community college students, and Black students, nearly all of whom reported that the emergency aid they received enabled their continued enrollment. We also asked emergency aid recipients what they used the funds for. And it may be unsurprising given longstanding basic needs security struggles that have been made worse by the pandemic that over half of students reported using their emergency aid for food. And notably, use for covering food expenses was highest among community college students. As we think about how critical financial support is for enabling students to stay on track, it's particularly important to note that students who received emergency aid were also more likely to report having re-enrolled in the fall 2020 term. So what else might help students stay enrolled and graduate? Our survey asked them. We asked about 7 specific policy options and how helpful each would be for their ability to stay enrolled and graduate. Over half of students reported each of these items would help, with the highest share of students reporting that increased financial aid awards to cover more non-tuition costs would be helpful. Notably, students expecting a delay in completing their program as a result of the pandemic were more likely to report each of these options would be helpful. Looking at the most popular option at the top of this graph, 84% of students expecting a delay reported that increased financial aid to cover more non-tuition costs would be helpful. 69% of students not expecting a delay indicated it would help, a high share in its own right. Larger financial aid awards to help meet non-tuition expenses also rises to the top, in particular for community college students and older students. Now looking at the other policy options we asked about, more than 3/4 of students expecting a degree delay said emergency aid for unexpected drops in income or increased expenses, financial aid availability for more low-income students, and increased access to food, housing, and other basic needs resources would help them stay enrolled and graduate. Students also reported that support for Wi-Fi and other technological equipment, more federal work study opportunities, and expanded mental health counseling and support would be helpful. So having shared a little bit about what students in our survey report about what would help them, I'd like to turn now to TICAS' Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy, Michelle Streeter, to talk about additional steps federal policymakers can take to make the kinds of support students need a reality.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, I'm Michelle Streeter. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work on federal policy at TICAS, and I'm happy to briefly discuss how the survey findings and what we've heard today from Chris and Erica underscore the importance of major federal action to make college more affordable, accessible, and equitable for all students. And I like to kind of start by saying we think about this on two parallel tracks, really, making sure that students have more support and resources within the system we have now, while also making sure that there are structural changes to build a better system for the future. So I'll start by highlighting again how much our findings and what we heard from our two students today demonstrate the importance of supporting students' basic needs and how important it is when we think about college and when we think about covering college costs to account for these costs beyond tuition. So food, housing, transportation, we heard a lot about healthcare, including mental health care, child and other dependent care, and broadband access, especially during the past year, and how integral these supports and resources are to help students stay enrolled in school and complete their program. So throughout the pandemic, we actually did see Congress send a lot of support to students through the higher education emergency relief funds, through the big relief packages over the year. As part of this, we saw an expansion of federal SNAP eligibility to college students, which was wonderful. And we've also seen some really exciting momentum on proposals to better connect students with these federal means tested benefit programs via their financial aid applications and the financial aid and student affairs offices. So going forward, strengthening coordination between federal agencies and colleges to ensure that students are connected to these programs is really critical. Again, as we heard from our students, these are really pertinent and important issues even post-pandemic, and making sure that students have access and connection to the support that is available to them is really important. And another huge piece, kind of from a more systemic perspective, a really big piece of this kind of puzzle for helping students better cover college costs, meet basic needs, and complete a degree or credential is doubling the Pell Grant. The federal Pell Grant program is the most important federal investment in college affordability. It helps around 7 million students every year attend and complete school, but the grant amount falls far short of covering college costs for low-income students. And at its peak, way back in the 80s, the grant actually covered more than 75% of the cost of attending a four-year public college. It now covers 29% of that cost, which is the lowest share in the program's history. So unsurprisingly, we see Pell recipients borrow student loans at twice the rate of non-Pell recipients. And again, these are the lowest income students who need the most assistance in covering college costs, and we're asking them to borrow more than their peers, which is just unacceptable and unsustainable in terms of mobility and completion. And kind of, again, another somewhat shocking statistic and comparison is, according to one affordability model from the National College Access Network, only 25% of public four-year colleges and fewer than half of public two-year colleges are affordable to the average Pell recipient. So that's, just let that sink in for a moment. But if the Pell Grant were to be doubled, over 80% of both public two and four-year colleges would become affordable for the same student. So from 25% and less than 50% to 80%, that would be a huge jump. And again, why we think doubling the Pell Grant is so critical for access and affordability. In addition to doubling Pell, we also want to see federal lawmakers comprehensively address one of the major root causes of rising college costs and rising tuition, which is state funding for public colleges has been in a somewhat steady decline. It has gone up and down a little bit over economic cycles, but over the past decades, it has declined significantly from its peak. Public colleges enroll over 3/4 of all undergrads. So this has a significant effect again on college costs and the majority of students who are trying to get a degree. And colleges that serve a high number of low-income students and students of color they bear the brunt of this underfunding and are inequitably funded compared to even other public institutions. We also know that many colleges lack the funds to provide the kind of support and advising programs and services that we know students need to persist and complete a degree. And so this lack of funding has a lot of implications, not only on kind of rising tuition costs and rising attendance costs, but also on students' ability to maintain their enrollment and have access to smaller class sizes and tenure track facility, and kind of has all of these implications and domino effects that makes it more difficult for students to enroll, more difficult to cover costs, and more difficult to actually complete a degree and have the support they need. So to address all of these challenges, we want the federal government to basically make a big new investment in public colleges and create a new partnership with states, because there is no kind of state and federal partnership at this moment, and states are a huge part of the picture in terms of funding public colleges and helping support students. And so we want to see them partner to better support public institutions, focus on lowering costs and lowering tuition costs for students, funding institution types more equitably, and better equipping colleges to support all of the needs of their students. We also see, as part of this bigger comprehensive systemic approach, the importance of strengthening accountability to make sure that colleges are held accountable for serving their students well. So in addition to kind of the front end affordability pieces, I also did quickly want to touch on student loan repayment, and our concern that borrowers be protected whenever repayment restarts. It's really important that policymakers account for and really are aware of the financial impact of the pandemic, as we've heard today, and our survey findings show, as they look to transition borrowers back into repayment. It will be really important to provide timely and clear information about repayment obligations and timing, just to make people aware when they're going to start having a monthly payment again. Very simple things like that. Ensuring there are safety nets in place so that borrowers aren't being harmed by unaffordable or unexpected payments, and making sure that borrowers have access to more affordable income-based plans. So income-based repayment plans are a really important safety net. They allow a student to repay their loans based on a percentage of their income rather than a higher monthly payment they may have otherwise. But it can be really difficult for students to access and stay enrolled in these plans. And so we'd like to see federal policymakers kind of prioritize making those plans easier to access. And just generally making sure there's help and support for those who need it as we make this big transition. So those are kind of it's a lot of asks, a lot of requests, a lot of things the federal government can do, and we're really hopeful that there's appetite to do these things, but we are really grateful to the students for coming in today and kind of sharing their perspective and bringing this down to the level of who we're serving. So with that, I will pass it over to Laura to share the state perspective. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to have all of you here with us today. My name is Laura Szabo-Kubitz. I am the California Affordability Program Director at TICAS, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. It's been incredibly educational to learn directly from our students, both through our eloquent speakers today and the statewide survey. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes now about the ongoing efforts at the state level that could very much help support them on their paths to higher education attainment. The Cal Grant program was undoubtedly a crowning achievement in its time, and it certainly remains a leading state grant program today, but the intervening years have really revealed its key structural limitations, which have serious equity implications. Eligible applicants who are more than 1 year out of high school have had to compete for a very limited number of awards, and the value of student stipends for non-tuition costs, without having been pegged to a meaningful threshold like the grant's tuition component has fallen dramatically and covers just 9% of students' non-tuition college costs today. At TICAS and through our coalition of Californians for College Affordability, we have long called for meaningful reforms to and investments in state need-based financial aid to support vulnerable Californians, in particular those who are lower income and students of color. And the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, as we've been hearing about today, only underscores the urgency for movement on both. As we've been hearing about, students of color have long been among the hardest hit by the pandemic, with over half of Black and Latinx students reporting increased symptoms of food insecurity and half of Black students reporting challenges with paying for housing. The Legislative Budget Committee's current proposals to increase access to the Cal Grant entitlement by removing age barriers and strengthen the Access Award by increasing how much it covers for non-tuition costs Both would meaningfully support underserved students' ability to cover their basic needs, including safe housing, nourishing meals, and child and health care, which many students, including our great panelists like Chris and Erica, illustrate are critically important. As we've heard compellingly today, the impacts of the ongoing pandemic on students' budgets make even more urgent the need for these investments in Cal Grants now. Addressing the structural limitations of the current Cal Grant program are certainly crucial for students across all types of colleges, and they're of particular importance for our students at community colleges, which currently receive just 7% of state Cal Grant dollars, despite serving 2/3 of the state's college students, including the majority of our state's low-income students and students of color. This is in great part because many older students are left out of the program, and the access award they do receive is very small. While older students' odds of receiving a Cal Grant have improved in recent years from a distressing 1 in 16 in 2014 to about 1 in 8 today, due to state investments in the competitive program, more than 200,000 otherwise eligible older applicants with an average family income of just about $33,000 were not offered a Cal Grant this past year alone. And 3 out of 4 of these eligible non-recipients attend a community college. So the legislative proposal to remove the age barrier to entitlement awards would be a huge help for older students across the state and at community colleges in particular. While college is certainly expensive for almost all students, the affordability burden falls most heavily on the lowest income. Those who come from families that make less than $30,000 a year must put about half of their income towards covering college costs after available grant aid, compared to about 1/4 or less for students in other income groups. This has significant racial equity implications, with the majority of California's Black, Latinx, and Native American students coming from the lowest income families. So during these final days of budget negotiations, our coalition continues to advocate for equitably strengthening and reforming the Cal Grant program, most immediately by supporting these proposals to remove age and time out of high school barriers to Cal Grant entitlements and increasing support for key non-tuition costs. Moreover, the governor has also proposed important investments in reducing the underlying cost drivers of college, such as affordable housing, digital textbooks, and access to technology. And while the current proposals do not embody all of the changes we would need to see for a fully reformed Cal Grant program, including streamlining and simplifying the program and linking the access award to an automatic growth factor, these investments would be historic and would go very far in supporting higher education attainment for the most vulnerable Californians who have long had the needed the support to attend college without borrowing or working excessively, and whose need has only been amplified by COVID-19. So I hope that was helpful in tying in what we've been hearing today with a really historic opportunity that lies before us in California. Thank you. So much, Laura, and thank you, Michelle, also. That wraps up our prepared remarks for the webinar and our conversations. We'd love to hear questions from you all about the audience, anything having to do about our survey, questions for our students, or for the policy options and priorities that Laura and Michelle discussed. If all of our panelists can come on video so we can all join the virtual stage together, it'd be nice. And I'll give folks a couple minutes to think about questions that they might have. As they do that, I have a question sort of for Michelle. You talked a lot about the importance of increasing the Pell Grant, and we've heard a lot today about basic needs challenges. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the connection between Pell and addressing those basic needs insecurities at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. I think, Pell Grants are extremely well targeted to the most economically vulnerable students. And so that's really important to remember kind of as a baseline. And for many low-income students, depending on the state where they're attending school, many, especially community college students are often in this boat. They can access a program or a grant program that actually covers their direct tuition and fee costs. This is obviously not the case for all students, but for many students, if they do have these direct costs covered through a grant program, their Pell Grant can actually be used to cover other costs, including the costs we talked so much about today: housing, transportation, food, books, and other supplies, costs that we know can be a major roadblock to completion. So regardless of whether someone's, tuition and fees are covered. Pell Grants are really important for that as well. But even for those students, Pell Grants can be super important in giving them access to covering those services. And so that's another kind of feather in the cap for the Pell Grant program, and why they're so important and so well targeted to the students who need the most assistance.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Laura, I have a question for you. When we've talked a lot about, and I think it's clear, the benefit of increased financial support for students if we make the kinds of investments that you mentioned, and how important, how impactful that would be in individual lives. There's also, of course, the reality of fiscal considerations for a state in particular. So how would these reforms that you've talked about and that are important priorities, how would they benefit, what kind of impact would they have on the state in addition to individual students' lives?
Yes, I mean, these are certainly significant investments by the state, ongoing upwards of $500 million a year. And while they're critical to strengthening individual Californians' economic stability and upward mobility, they are also integral to California's ability to continue to thrive as a global leader. We see from research that several labor market outcomes are notably stronger for those with college degrees. So in addition to higher tax receipts from college graduates, these Californians will also then be less likely to rely on public services and benefits. So really, it's vital to both individual Californians, but to the economic health of the state itself, that these investments are in the final budget. I think that we will all reap the benefits of these investments many times over, even though they are some hefty costs up front.
Thank you, Laura. Before we wrap up, one last chance to ask a question, and of course we're always available at TICAS for additional if you have any other questions afterwards. But before we wrap up, give it a minute. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you so much to our students, Erica and Chris, for joining us. Oh, we have one question. Michelle asks, what are the changes that community colleges and their foundations could implement sooner rather than later to help address students' basic needs? Laura, do you want to take that one?
Oops, I mute myself. Yeah, I mean, I think that a couple different things. One is that it's confusing because the names are similar, but there's the Community College Promise Grant, which is the former BOG fee waiver. And then there's also these additional funds for a California Promise that community colleges have at their disposal, which can be used to provide, to cover tuition for all first-time, full-time students, regardless of need. But it's also within the language of the law that those dollars can be used to help cover non-tuition costs. There's a lot of flexibility involved there. So one thing I would say is that, if you want to encourage your institutions to really look at their student populations and see what their needs are, I think that can be incredibly helpful. I know several years ago at Mount San Antonio College in California, for example, they use their IT department to look at institutional data, and really we're trying to figure out how could those funds be best targeted. And I think, of course, also there's, the foundations are incredibly valuable in terms of providing stipends for emergency aid for students. We also had the early budget action a couple of months ago in California, where I believe I'd have to double check, but I think it was $100 million in emergency financial aid for California community college students. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of opportunities that are already available. And it's my hope that on top of that, reforming and strengthening the Cal Grant program will make more of those dollars available to all students, and especially community college students.
Thanks, Laura. And just adding on to that, whatever colleges can do to connect students to resources that are already there, connecting students to potentially eligible students to SNAP. There's been additional pandemic related rule changes to that have increased access or sort of smooth some of the barriers for college students to enroll in SNAP. making sure that they're aware of those changes and sort of leveraging all the resources around the community college, in addition to providing extra targeted relief where they can. All right, well, thank you all. Again, thanks to our students, thanks to our panelists, thanks for our amazing comms team who this would not be possible without. Angelique has dropped our survey findings into the chat there. We'll also be making sure that you receive an email from us with all the resources and the work that we've published so far related to our survey analysis. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.